Hey everybody, today on Enterprise Home Lab we're going to talk about iscsi and we're going to talk about Proxmox. If you're watching this, you probably already know what iscsi is, but for those of you that don't, iscsi stands for Internet Small Computer Systems Interface, and it's a protocol that's popular in the enterprise space for mounting block-level storage over a network. So what does that mean? Well, you're probably familiar with protocols like CIFS, which is used by Samba and Windows file sharing, NFS, and FTP. These protocols transfer files over a network, like an MP3 file or a text file. iscsi doesn't transfer files. Well, it does, but not explicitly. iscsi transfers chunks of files, specifically the blocks, as they would be stored on a hard drive. So it's operating at a lower level than these other protocols. And that means instead of presenting a file system to a client computer, it presents a raw hard drive that can be formatted, partitioned, and used like an actual hard drive attached directly to the system. This may sound complicated, but it's really not, and iscsi allows sysadmins to do some fairly interesting things. One thing you can do with iscsi is mount the same block device to multiple hypervisors to facilitate highly available storage for virtual machines, and we're going to cover that in a future video. Now, just a heads up, when talking about iscsi systems, the terms client and server are replaced with initiator and target, respectively. So, you've decided to do some diskless booting. What do you need to make this work? First, you need something to host your iscsi LUNs. If you're going to be doing this at home for experimentation, you can definitely use something like a Synology NAS, or you can even run the iscsi target on another server. There's an iscsi target package available in the repositories for most Linux distributions. For environments where uptime is important, you're going to want something with high availability features like a NetApp storage appliance or a Dell PowerVault. I have a PowerVault MD3220i, so I'll be using that for demonstration purposes. The other thing you need to make this work is support for iscsi booting. There are a few different ways to do this. There are network cards that support iscsi boot. There are iscsi host bus adapters, which are similar but don't act as a NIC for the host server. And there's PXE firmware like iPXE. Most enterprise servers like those in Dell's PowerEdge line will support iscsi through the LOM ports. Those are the LAN on motherboard ports or the built-in network cards. I'm going to be doing this tutorial on a Dell M630, which is the blade equivalent of the R630. This process should be exactly the same for other 13th gen Dell servers, including the R730, and is likely similar on 12th and 14th gen Dell servers. I don't own any HP servers, so I don't know anything about the process with them. This video is primarily going to focus on installing Proxmox to an iscsi target and then booting from a Dell server. Before we can install Proxmox, we need to allocate the storage on our target disk array. The process for this will vary depending on what storage system you have. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be using a Dell PowerVault MD3220i, so I'll quickly go over allocating space on that. I already have Dell's MDSM, or Modular Disk Storage Manager, installed and set up, so I'm going to go ahead and open that. I'm going to click on my storage array. Go to Storage and Copy Services, right-click on Total Unconfigured Capacity, and I'm going to add a disk group. So it tells me that I have about 3.3 terabytes in unconfigured capacity. I'm going to click Next, and we're going to create a disk group name. So let's call this YouTube tutorial. And automatic is fine for what we're going to be doing. Let's just do a RAID 1. So there are two different options that it's going to come up with. So I have two 1.2 terabyte drives and two 600 gigabyte drives. So I'm going to go ahead, click on this option, and what this is going to do is create one RAID 1 array with a total capacity of 553 gigabytes. So I'm going to click Finish. It's going to say the disk group was successfully created. Okay, so you need to create at least one virtual disk before you can use the capacity of the new disk group. Would you like to create a virtual disk using disk groups now? I'm going to hit yes. So this is the configuration page for the new virtual disk. What I want to do is specify my maximum storage. Just so this matches the free capacity. And let's call this again YouTube tutorial. And we're going to go ahead and map that to a host later. We don't have the SSD cache license installed. I also don't have any SSDs in here. Virtual disk I/O characteristics. For us, what we're going to be doing is just regular file system work. We're going to be booting, so we don't need any special configuration for databases, multimedia, or anything else. I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. And it says the new virtual disk was successfully created. So we're going to go ahead and click OK. If you look at the object tree over on the left, you'll see that there's a clock icon next to the virtual disk that we just created. And what that tells us is that it's initializing this virtual disk. So there's a process in progress with that disk. And we can see the progress bar down here if we have that virtual disk selected. So we're going to go ahead and let this initialize. But while we do that, I'm going to go over here to host mappings. And we are going to create a new host map. So I'm going to go ahead and actually delete my previous test so I can show you the process to create a new one. I'm going to go ahead, right-click on Storage Array, hover over Define, and then click Host. So we can call this whatever we want. I'm going to go ahead and call it YouTube Demo again. I'm going to leave this to the default. Click Next. So I'm going to create a new host port identifier. And essentially what this is it's an IQN for the initiator or the client. So let's call it IQN.2022-11. Okay, that looks good. And we're going to go ahead and create a label for it. Add that identifier and click Next. Now it's going to ask us what kind of operating system we're using. And I'm just going to go ahead and say Linux. Click Next. If we just create a new host that's not part of a group, it's going to ask us if this host is going to be part of a cluster. I'm going to say yes because eventually I am going to have it set up like this. So this host will share access to the same virtual disks with other hosts. It doesn't necessarily have to be the one that we just created, but in the future, if you're planning on having this host be part of a cluster, you can go ahead and probably click yes now. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes there. And what do we want to call that host group? Let's call it YouTube Demo 2. Say Next and Finish. All right, so we're not going to create another host right now, but we can see that it created the host group for us, and it created the host. So now I'm going to right-click on the host, and I'm going to say Add LUN Mapping. Okay, so host, group, or host. So we're only talking about the host, right? We're only going to map this virtual disk image to this host because this is going to be the boot image for this host. I'm going to click on YouTube Tutorial, which is the disk that we just specified. Click Add. And you see it populated. So I'm going to hit Close now. Once we click on the host from the object tree, we can see that we have successfully mapped our 553 gigabyte virtual disk to this host. Now that we've allocated our storage, let's talk about installing Proxmox to iscsi. If you're booting using your LAN on motherboard ports, you probably can't mount the target and install your OS normally. Iscsi boot usually means just that. You can boot from an iscsi target, but you can't mount it permanently to complete a normal installation. What that means is that you can't configure your iscsi connection settings, run the installer, and install to the LUN. You have to actually mount the target from inside the installer, install to the target, and then configure the server to boot from that same target separately. It's not particularly intuitive, but I'll guide you through the process. I complete the installation in a virtual machine just for the sake of simplicity, but you can do it from any computer or server you have laying around too. I'm going to create a virtual machine for the installer. Set a name. Going to select my Proxmox image. The default settings here are fine. I'm going to go ahead and just remove the disk because we're not going to need that. Single CPU is fine. 2 gigs of RAM is fine. Now, make sure that the virtual machine has access to the storage target. So for me, that's going to be this VMBR10. And with that, we can actually go ahead and start this VM. So on the first screen, the installer is going to ask us how we want to proceed with the installation. We can either do a normal Proxmox install, which is going to be the first option or the default, and then we also have this advanced options. We're going to go ahead and hit advanced options. We want to install Proxmox VE in debug mode. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter on that. And what that's going to do is it's going to drop us to a terminal before and after we run through the normal graphical installer that you're probably used to. After we select this, a terminal is going to show the installer booting, and then after a few seconds, the text will stop scrolling. Once it does, we're going to press enter, and we're going to see this prompt. Now, this isn't where we need to be to get started with our install, so we're going to press Control-D to exit there. And then at that point, debug mode is going to take us to the next step. Now you should see this root at Proxmox prompt. At this point, we're in a live environment, and we can set up all of our prerequisites for the install. Remember that since this is a live environment, any changes we make will not persist or reboot. So if you reboot the installer virtual machine or system at any point in this process, the state is wiped clean, and you're going to have to start from the beginning of this VM. iscsi is a network protocol, so the first thing we're going to have to do is set up a network connection. To start this, I'm going to run IPA just to get my network interfaces. And I see I have this one here, ENS18, and it is showing as down. So the first thing we need to do is bring that up. So I'm going to do IP link set ENS18 up. Of course, you're going to have to replace ENS18 with whatever interface you have. Now we see that our link is up. Now I'm going to configure an IP address. IP, addr, and notice how I specified my IP address in CIDR format and specified my network device. Make sure you're replacing your IP address with one on the same subnet as your iscsi target, and of course replace ENS18 with your interface name. To confirm our settings took, you can run IPA again, and we can see here that we have the IP address we specified, and at this point we should be able to ping our storage target. Okay, that's one interface, and that's the other. So now I can ping the target, and that means we've successfully set up our network in the live environment. The next step is to install the iscsi packages we need to our live environment. Now we're going to install 3 packages that are going to help us handle our iscsi connection. Now, this third package won't actually finish the installation, but once you see this right here, it's safe to Control-C out of it. And it's going to say that there were errors processing it, but we can safely ignore that. Now that we've installed all of our dependencies for iscsi, we can try to connect to our target. To do that, we're going to run the iscsistart command, and we need to specify our initiator iqn. That's going to be the same as what we specified over here. So we're going to go ahead and just check our iqn. Then we're going to specify our target iqn. And this will be provided to you somewhere in your target storage settings. So for me, I'm going to click Setup and Manage iscsi settings. And then this is the IQ that I need to enter. It is a rather long string. Then we say -G, capital N, -A. And then here we're going to put in the IP address of our target. So that's going to be for me 192.168.130.101. And I'm going to hit enter. Hope I typed in my IQN correctly. And it looks like I made an error somewhere in one of my IQNs. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, I think I see the problem here. 3038. And let's try that. Okay, so it looks like we're successfully connected to our target, and our virtual disk has been mounted. If we want to verify this further, we can run lsblk. And there we go. We can see that our SDA device is 553 gigs, and that's the size of the virtual disk that we created on the Power Vault. If you've made it this far, you can quit out of this shell with Control-D. That'll take us back to the graphical installer where we can continue the installation like normal. If you're completing this install on a virtual machine, you'll probably see a message that there's no support for hardware virtualization. This is okay because we don't need virtualization hardware support for the installation. I'm going to click OK on that, accept the EULA, and click Next. So now we see this /dev/SDA device set as our target hard disk. That's our iscsi drive. We don't need to set any options, so we can just click Next, enter our time and location info, Now, for the management network, you're going to want to pick one that isn't on the same interface as your storage network, as you could run into bottlenecks when moving VM data or large ISOs around. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to pick the same interface for now and switch it over later. Now, make sure you uncheck automatically reboot after successful installation, because we need to access the debug shell again after the install completes to configure a couple of things. Click Install and let the install run like any normal Proxmox install. Check back in a few minutes and you should see that the installation has completed. Click Reboot and you'll be dropped into another shell in our live environment. Next, we need to enter our new Proxmox install from the live environment. To do that, we're going to run these commands. we need to add a bit of configuration that will allow Proxmox to receive the iscsi parameters from our host's network interface. To do this, we just say iscsi_auto equals true, and we're going to save that. Then run update-grub and update-initramfs, passing in these parameters. Once that is complete, you can press Ctrl-D to exit this console, and the system will reboot into the installation media. Proxmox should be successfully installed onto the virtual disk we created on the Power Vault. You'll actually need to Ctrl-D twice, once to exit the chroot and a second time to exit the console itself. Now that Proxmox is installed, we should be able to boot into it from a server that has iscsi boot capabilities. If your server doesn't support iscsi boot natively, there are still ways you can accomplish this, but that's going to be beyond the scope of this video. The first thing I'm going to do is open the addr. Once in addr, I'm going to open the virtual console and turn the server on. As the system starts booting, I'm going to press F2 to enter System Setup. Click System BIOS at the menu, and then click Network Settings. At the bottom of this page, enter an initiator IQN for the server. You don't have to, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to reuse the same initiator IQN that we used before for the installation. I'm also going to take note of the LUN assigned to the virtual disk that we mapped because we're going to need that. Go ahead and click on iscsi device 1 settings. Normally you're going to have connection 1 enabled, connection 2 either enabled or disabled, and this is for booting from one of multiple IP addresses that your target might have, especially in a high availability setup. I'm going to click connection 2 settings because that's what I have enabled. And basically you're just going to fill these settings out. So interface, that's basically which port on which physical port on the server are we trying to do this boot from. IPv4 or IPv6. You can tag a VLAN on the port. I'm not doing that. I just have the VLAN untagged on the physical switch port. But you can do that if you'd like. If you were going to do that, you would enable that. You'd set your VLAN ID and the priority, but I'm going to leave that disabled. You can set a retry count and a timeout. I'm going to just leave these to the defaults for now. There is no DHCP server on my network, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that as disabled. Then I'm going to configure the IP address of the initiator. Again, that's the IP address of this server, of this M630 as it's attempting the boot. Specify our subnet mask and no gateway because there isn't one on this network. Down here, we're going to specify the target IQN of our storage array. That's the same as we entered before. The IP address of that target and the port. Now here is where we have to specify the target boot LUN. So again, back here we see that we're using LUN 0. So we're going to go ahead and swap that out. So that's going to be a 0. I'm going to hit back, 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 finish. Settings have changed. You want to save the changes? Yes. The settings were saved successfully. Awesome. We hit OK, finish, and exit and reboot. And with any luck, this should reboot into our new Proxmox installation. So it looks like I actually made a mistake when entering the initiator iqn. So I'm just going to hit F2, go back into the settings, fix that, save the changes, and reboot. And there we have Proxmox booting from an iscsi target. That's it. That's really it. It's not particularly difficult. There's just a lot of steps to configure everything. I hope this has brought some value to you. I've been experimenting with all things Linux for years now, and I figured I'd try to share some of what I've learned. I have a few other videos planned, some more educational and practical than others. If you're interested in this sort of thing, please consider liking and subscribing, as it helps the YouTube algorithm recommend the video to other people. Happy experimenting, and thanks for watching.